So next up, and this was also not planned, but we're going to finish with two excellent projects on Buddhism. The first of those is from Shaun-Megan McNally, and the title of her thesis project is Reacquainting Death with Ahimsa, a Death Doula's Guide to Universal Terminality.
Hi everybody, I'm Shaun, and it's funny because my little brother flew in from Boston this morning, and on the way here I was like, yeah, so I'm going to talk about death, and he went, I didn't bring my headphones and I'm afraid of death. And I was like, well, that's why we're going to talk about it. So I'd like everyone to start by closing your eyes. For real, do this, and we can't be shy here, so not allowed. So breathe in first through the nose. Hold your breath for a moment, and out through the mouth. And now start to conjure an image of a person or an animal, somebody, something special to you that has met death. And on the count of 3, we're going to say that name out loud. So 1, 2, 3. Great. So there once was a little girl who did not fear death. You guys can open your eyes now, by the way. You have to do this in darkness, and you'll see. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so she was so happy at her paternal grandfather's funeral because she didn't fear death. She was going to partake in the funerary services. Crampy was in heaven. This was awesome. This little girl loved to go to the graveyard and read every single gravestone. And do gravestone rubbings because nothing's more fun than that. She would even bury coins at the cemetery for Nanny and Grampy to spend in heaven. She would tap dance. I don't know which one. Oh, there. she would tap dance and sing on the graves for them because they obviously couldn't make it to her dance recital. And then something switched. And one night she was crying in bed because she was afraid of death. All of the sudden, would she be alone? Would she meet her parents again? Is heaven full of clouds, she wondered. Her dad came running in and laid down on the twin bed parallel, and he told her she would be with God and her family and don't worry, right? So she stopped worrying. But up until recently, that creeping feeling of dread would enter her heart and the thought of death would be ignored. So how many of you are probably going to die a bodily death? Right? Okay, cool. And how many of you are a little bit afraid? Right? Okay. So death is pretty fair because we're all going to go there, and it doesn't discriminate. So kind of, it's real. So it's a little bit funny because when people ask me what I'm studying and I tell them yoga studies at LMU, and they're immediately like, can you do the thing where you put your leg, and I'm like, oh, Parivritta Yantrasana, and they're like, what is that? And I'm like, sundial pose, and they're like, oh yeah, that one, can you do that? And I'm like, no, I can't do that. And I'm like, I'm working on it, and so, they look really disappointed. And yeah, it would be awesome to be able to do King Pigeon, but for me, the yogic philosophy and the yamas and the niyamas, they have to be reinforced by us every day. And for some of you, in case you don't know, it's like the 10 Commandments, the laws that we live by of kindness. And so yeah, I'm working on my asana practice. And what I've taken away from this program from our Jain studies in India and mysticism and studying the Hatha Yoga Pradipika and modern yoga is the tenet of ahimsa. Ahimsa or nonviolence is it's really what this world needs right now. And I think that it's our duty to leave this program as warriors, fear of Vajrasana, right? And be strong and stern with the conviction to use this education to practice ahimsa and to show compassion. This world needs to use this technology and this technology because it's what has created this technology. We are the OG technology. And, we need to go back to this little girl, right, who dances for the dead, because obviously that girl is me. And as a duty to this program, I must follow my dharma and my truth and my passion for death and dying. And it's been reignited by this program. So my path is to aid and support those who are dying and their loved ones. The Dalai Lama writes, "No less significant than preparing for our own death is helping others to die well. As a newborn baby, each of us was helpless, and without the care and kindness we received, then we would not have survived. Because the dying are also unable to help themselves, we should relieve them of discomfort, anxiety, and assist them as far as we can to die with composure." So many of us here are practitioners, lovers, have some knowledge of yoga, even if you don't Om. The Mandukya Upanishad. So Om, right? It actually, every time you Om, you're like honoring death. The A is the waking state, the U is the dream state, the M is the deep sleep state. That's like getting so close to death. And then there's that vibration that we all feel. And that can be represented as death, but that's actually like the primordial vibration that we go back to. So there's really no such thing as death. And I turned to the Tibetan Buddhists, because they have mastered the art of death, or maybe what Swami Shivananda calls dissolving into Om. The Mandukya Upanishad is Vedantic, therefore the text adheres to the belief of Atman, defined by our friend Mr. Georg Feuerstein, I can never say that, it's really hard, as the transcendental self, which is identical with the absolute. In contrast, a quintessential Buddhist concept is anatman, no self. It can be reasoned that Vedanta and Buddhism apply contrary theories to achieve the same path, some ultimate liberation, whether it's the self or the no self. And the Tibetan view of consciousness after death proves that consciousness can ascend, and even if ascension is not achieved, that it can't be destroyed, it doesn't die. So, I need a click too, Elizabeth. I need a click. So here I look to the Mahayana Buddhist notion of the Bodhisattva, one who is able to reach nirvana but delays doing so out of compassion in order to save suffering beings. And I think many of us are leaving this program compassionate with the intention of relieving suffering in our own unique ways. I'm not saying I've reached nirvana, like I don't think I've really quite been there yet, but I have the intention of being a compassionate being. So, reflecting on the Dalai Lama's quote, I intend to use my compassion to aid beings, mostly humans, in leaving this world for the next season of their lives. I feel like in the West, we turn away from death. We don't want to face it. When our elders start to move closer to death, we often put them in nursing homes. And then when they truly start to dissolve, which is essentially break down, and I don't like that term breakdown, but I do like dissolve, but we do bring them to the hospital because we haven't learned how to die or how to be comfortable talking about or being around death. The Dalai Lama also says death is a natural part of life, which we will surely have to face sooner or later. To my mind, there are two ways while we are alive. We can either choose to ignore it, or we can confront the prospect of our own death. And by thinking clearly about it, try to minimize the suffering that it can bring. However, in neither of these ways can we actually overcome it. And so even if somebody is placed in a medical facility, the doctors and the nurses can only provide a certain amount of compassionate comfort. They're there to, they have to run, they have to save the next person or do the next thing to make the next person comfortable. So the dying need companionship, just like a newborn baby needs companionship. So I looked to the idea of the death doula. And so what is a doula? A doula, the act of educational, loving, respecting, listening, embracing, advocating for, and assisting a woman prenatally during labor, childbirth, and after. Death doula A, the act of educating, loving, respecting, listening, embracing, advocating for, and assisting any being during their transition from this body into the next phase of consciousness. So I don't believe any of us should go alone, and the way that the Western world has made death taboo is deeply troubling for me. So I started to look to the idea of what death truly is and what happens from an Eastern perspective, specifically the Tibetan standpoint. And I think the conception of death being an end and a void is what ignites this huge amount of fear in all of us. We're attached to our loved ones, to our cozy beds, to the feel of the sunshine. But how do we open up this conversation? So after being in Ladakh last summer, the essence of Tibetan Buddhism resonated with me deeply, and the Tibetan outlook on death is healthy and wildly colorful, and there's really no such thing as death. So when someone dies, it's really more of a beginning of a journey of consciousness and our collective consciousness. So we have to backtrack here. I looked for my thesis at the Tibetan Book of the Dead. This is a Western moniker for this book, which we'll talk about. And the text is Vajrayana Buddhist text, and it's used as a funerary manual or a map. It's like a travel guide as to what you do after your breath leaves your body. And what it is it's a calling of a prayer for 49 days after one leaves the body, and they're in this liminal in-between state. And so in my thesis, I called this person the traveler because they're not dead. And so this is a nice quote that I'm going to actually skip over, but if you didn't read it and you'd like to, I can forward it to you. So the text is really the Bardo Mandala, liberation in the intermediate state through hearing. There's a few different ways that this has been translated, but this is because when somebody gets to the other side, they can still hear. So you call prayers to them. And it's attributed to Padmasambhava, an Indian adept who introduced Buddhism to Tibet. So he brought it from India up to Tibet in around 7th century. And then it was translated by Walter Yealing Evan Wentz. And he only translated 3 chapters, and this is what we have come to know as the Book of the Dead. And like I said, it's a funerary manual in which the Bardo states are discussed. So we are actually going to discuss the Bardo states in a minute, but I will let you know that I used Robert A.F. Thurman's Tibetan Book of the Dead, Liberation Through Understanding of the Between, which is another translation. I had an interview with Dr. John Casey, and I interviewed people who cared for people while they were dying in their homes and didn't send them other places. And I started my own meditation practice, which I had always had a physical practice. I was like, I cannot sit still. But I started to try to get to that dissolving state that we need to understand death. And here is a Bardo Mandala. So we're going to leave that up for just a moment. And I used Robert Thurman's translation because it's accessible. I found his comparison of preparing for death like packing for a trip, and like not a trip to Venice Beach. It's like a trip through the Amazon jungle. You are getting ready for a big moment. And you wouldn't just grab your flip-flops and go to the Amazon jungle. So Thurman explains many esoteric and not so esoteric, but very Buddhist ways of preparing the consciousness to move through the 3 Bardo states after death, which I promise we'll talk about the Bardos. So here is a mandala, and one preparation is studying the mandalas, which are maps through the stages of the Bardos, and studying them may allow one to navigate their way in after-death states. There's also mandalas for many other purposes, but for the purposes of here and now. The deities of Buddhism, which you see here, they can actually be replaced, if you're going to implement this practice, by Jesus, Mother Earth, fairies, I don't know, whatever you believe in. And he also discusses mantra, so Om Mani Padme Hum, chanting, and mudra, to start to find practices. However, he also suggests for like everyday people finding peace in everyday activities as starting to prepare for death. So for instance, finding ease in relationships. If you feel anger or jealousy, the practice of recognizing these really tangible feelings, which only cause confusion, is the beginning of a way to prepare for death. Because when consciousness reaches the Bardos, if it is individualized by feelings and attachments, it's difficult for the traveler to find peace or possibly complete liberation or find that primordial state of the mind. So we're going to skip ahead here. The book discusses really mainly the 3 last Bardos, which are the moment of death, luminosity, where the dreamlike visions occur, and the transmigratory process, where you're either reborn or not. So really quickly, the Chikai Bardo is the moment of death. And you have the ability here to either liberate or to you pretty much see the light, to put it into really colloquial terms, and you can be liberated from the cycle of rebirth. And this is really difficult. It's fleeting. And these guys really liked, by the way, the Bardo Total for its psychedelic properties. They wrote a whole book and got fired from Harvard for it. So but it's a moment. It's a really quick moment, and it's it's about the time it takes to digest a meal. Then they move and then they move through the Chunyid Bardo, which you go through states of peaceful and wrathful deities. And this is when the body starts to, the consciousness starts to see these different lights. And every day has a different colored light, which I'm running out of time, so I can't really get into it. But pretty much these lights are really reflected from your consciousness, and they're like a prism. And every day, the different colored light is really the true light that you can go to. You have a moment to recognize it and to either be free or not. And then you might meet Yama, and I would not put him into Death Doula because he's scary. And so this is, again, something I have to gloss over because I ran out of time. But essentially, you always have the opportunity to be reborn, and or to find this liberation. And I guess the main thing, I know I'm going over just a minute, what I really wanted to say about the Death Doula is it's important for her to sit and honor the person's passing. And when you're going through the Bardos, anything that you see is your own consciousness anyway. So if you can recognize that, it's like you're looking in a mirror. And so as a Death Doula, when you're sitting with the dying, you have to recognize that you're looking at yourself. It doesn't matter how much money you have, your education, none of that. You are going to be in that exact same spot no matter what you've done. And so you have to come to this person with compassion and be willing to sit with it, not be afraid of it. And I think I should just wrap it up right now, but you should all watch Zen in the Art of Dying. That she inspired me, and she allows people to die at home peacefully and creatively, and she opens up the conversation of dying. Death Doula's Toolkit. I will talk to you all about it later.
Yeah, I was thinking back to Madeline's presentation and remembering that I have seen this incredible hospice choir perform. Oh. And I wondered if there were any musical components to the Tibetan transition.
So I actually don't know. I really dissect. There's the mantra.
Yeah.
Musical. Oh, and there's the Tibetan bells and the. But I didn't really get too much into that. I really dissected. I pretty much did a literary review of the Bardo Total, and I would like to do more. I just scratched the surface. I would never have considered myself probably going toward the Buddhist path until visiting Ladakh last summer, and then something about the ideas of the way that we can prepare for death so that it's not so scary. So I didn't really get into the sound element, but I think it would be a path I'd really love to collaborate with Madeline on, or to even just study, go back, Yeah.
Have you worked with or talked to people who are involved in hospice? Because that's a lot of what they do, as I understand it, is medically keeping people comfortable and easing them out, but I think it's also spiritual.
So I thought about it because, one of my favorite uncles passed away really very young, and I didn't really get to talk about it in this, but when I did, I just didn't have time, but when you start to go, I picked the Tibetans because he didn't want to go into the hospital, my uncle didn't, and so he died at home, and my mom and her sisters helped him, and they had to keep reminding him that he was dying, because he would be confused, because his earth element broke down, his body started to go, and then the water element broke down, so he was getting really dehydrated and skinny, or sometimes you hold on to water, and then his body temperature couldn't stay constant, so the homeostasis, it couldn't keep up, and then the breath left, that final element, and these are represented in the Tibetan prayer fags, like these colors and these elements, and finally, when, before the air element went, he told the hospice nurse he wanted to come back as a hawk. And then he died at home, and they washed his body, and they prepared it, and they kept him there until it was time for him to go. And I thought that was just a really beautiful way that he was surrounded by his family. And there's a prayer that they talk about, and it's pretty much a prayer for your mentor. And he wasn't a very religious man, but he loved his mom so much, and so he couldn't keep his eyes open. But right before he went, he came in and he opened his eyes to see her. So it was like he got to see his mentor. So I've spoken with them, and I also am in contact with San Quentin. Somebody wrote Dr. Chappell about, he's on death row and he wants to learn more about yoga, so I've been in contact with them. And I'm getting permission to go talk to him. And as a death doula, you know, it doesn't only just have to be hospice. Like, I'm like, this guy wants to learn more about yoga. And so maybe that's going to be my role as the death doula. He's sentenced to death, but how can we make him live better while he's still here? So I'm, you know, all the avenues.
That's good.
Are the colors that you talked about that you go through and you see?
Yeah.
Do those have anything, are they related to the rainbow body?
Yeah, so, yeah, and then on the very last day, all of the colors come together in the peaceful deity realm. And then if you still don't recognize that that's the clear light, right, like, that's okay. You just have to go through a bunch of days with the wrathful deities, and they're like your parents giving you tough love. So it's not enjoyable, but you'll make it through most likely. Yeah. Yes, but yeah. And in Padmasambhava too, when he was born of the lotus, he had the rainbow aura. So I think it's all very synchronistic.
So through your project on reconsidering your thought about reincarnation?
Oh, I know. Everybody knows that I'm like, I don't want to be reincarnated. I want one and done. Yeah. So, no. But I think I'll find the clear light. I just moved myself really hard.